Thank you, everybody. It's amazing to be back. For me, first conference in over a year. And we have our panel coming up now. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves in a second. But as we get into our conversation today, I think if this panel is half as good as the conversations we've had preparing for this panel, I think it'll be a spirited conversation and hopefully engaging for everybody who's joining us today. So without further ado, I'll let Megan, maybe you can start.
Sure,
We'll come down the line.
Yeah, so I'm Megan Robison. I'm a product stewardship engineer for PrintPack. We make food packaging. I am focused on recyclable paper packaging, but we do recyclable polyethylene and compostable packaging as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Drishti Masan. I'm an analyst at Lux Research. We're a research and consulting company working with Fortune 500 firms across the CPG, the oil and gas, energy, various different industries. I focus primarily on our materials and CPG space, looking at sustainable packaging primarily, but also just sustainable material as alternatives and business models in making the world a better place.
And I'm Lou Dolgan. I'm with American Packaging. I lead corporate business development and marketing for American Packaging. We're a 117, 18-year-old company. We're privately owned by a family that, like PrintPack is as well. And we're exclusively involved in flexible packaging and flexible packaging materials. And our efforts are multi-material. We don't have a bias between paper or plastic, so it was sort of interesting to get invited into this panel and be able to contribute a little bit of thought.
Great, thank you everybody for those intros. Like I said, we got a diverse panel, a lot of diverse opinions, and this panel is all about what's better, paper or plastic, and is one better? So without further ado, I think let's jump right into it. And at the end of the day, what is more sustainable? Is it plastic? Is it paper? Is it both? Maybe again, we'll start with Megan, and then we'll let others jump in after.
Great. So our answer to that question, like American Packaging, we are material agnostic as well. So when you look at plastic versus paper, I think the answer, like all things sustainability, is it depends. It depends on what product you're packaging. It depends on shelf life considerations. It depends on the condition of use. Where is the consumer when they're using this? Are they on the go? Is it food service packaging? All that different kinds of stuff. So I think outside of what the consumer is doing with it, are you looking to decrease your greenhouse gas use or emissions? Are you looking to decrease your water use, or are you looking to have a robust infrastructure for end of life? So if you're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emission and water, that's probably plastic. If you're looking to have an end-of-life infrastructure option that is robust, that's probably paper. So I think that it really depends on exactly what we're trying to package and what the plan for the package is.
At American Packaging, we tend to ask customers what their goals are, what their objectives are, and try to design one solution or the other depending on the direction they're going in. But we also want to look a little more broadly at answering that question, paper versus plastic, because you start to run into questions about the end of life and the ease of recycling that sort of can turn a lot of the technical things on end, and we sort of look at a much larger and much more holistic approach beyond the technical aspects and the application. We like to look at ease of use or ease of disposal and where things are likely to go and what those options look like.
Yeah, and kind of one of the big considerations that we've seen is also regionality, because in places where recycling is just not possible due to lack of infrastructure, one option just isn't viable versus somewhere where recycling is possible. That just changes the whole dynamics around how things can work. And it's also, I think, a question of the consumer behavior in those regions as well. if you have consumers that are, better at recycling because of maybe mandates or just social responsibilities, it's easier to use one material versus the other. So I think there's just so many different factors that go into it. So I hate that it's plastic versus paper, because really it has to be, we have to find a balance between both. We don't have enough trees in the world to make everything paper packaging, and we don't want to make everything plastic packaging, because that's just excessive reliance on petroleum and just plastic. So it has to be, like Megan said, it has to be a balance between the two. And I think the question is, how do we find that right balance? And it will vary depending on the application, the region, and even the company itself. So I think that's my version of it.
Yeah, I think in the conversations we had leading up, it's not that clear cut. There is nuance. There is no silver bullet when it comes to sustainability. And it's probably a combination of everything that we said today that's going to lead to the most informed and best decision. So, kind of picking up on that, how does the end of life options for both paper and plastic compare? Not only from an environmental standpoint, but also when it comes to society. Does anybody want to jump in first, or maybe put?
Got it.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
There are. I'm going to speak from a North American perspective, particularly with the United States. There are outlets for both. Paper, with a little bit of ink on it, has been recyclable for generations and continues to have a lot of outlets and a lot of applications where it's easily recyclable. Plastics, on the other hand, start to get a little more. There are outlets that allow you to recycle, that allow a consumer to recycle certain plastics, but you need the consumer to be a little educated in what those plastics are, and there are some labeling things that have sort of come about and to try to help facilitate the education and provide those insights. And then there's the conditioning that needs to take place with the plastics, that they have to be clean and dry, and then they need to be carried back to certain locations to be recycled. They're not going through the municipal waste stream. So I guess in that analysis, paper is much more viable and easier to as an outlet than is plastic, but plastic does have an avenue to be able to. Some plastics do have an avenue to be recyclable. It does open up questions about the practicality of it that need to be part of the business decision as you compare the two materials.
Right. Go ahead.
And to kind of jump in, I think it's also a question of how will recycling evolve into the future as things like chemical recycling or pyrolysis kind of start commercializing or start becoming more common. It will make plastic recycling a lot easier and a lot better, in that you can get virgin grade plastics from recycling, which would then enable less reliance on virgin plastics, more recycled plastics being able to enter the supply chain, which would, I think, in itself flip the game in a way, because I don't think we will ever reach the paper recycling to the point of where chemical recycling theoretically can go, in how well the material comes out at the end, how well the recyclate is. So I think, again, it's, like you said, it really depends on whether A, we're talking about today's infrastructure and future infrastructure, and B, it's a question of what does it look like regionally? And even in North America or just in the US, it's going to differ state by state. It's going to differ even on the community level. And so I think that's part of the challenge that today companies are, unable to solve at all. That is unfortunately a responsibility that falls on the entire value chain. And I think that's what is making this whole question of end of life so complex. And I think the one place that paper has a leg up is that it can biodegrade and it can compost as well. It doesn't just need to go through the recycling stream. And I think that's what is kind of driving the interest in paper packaging today versus waiting and hoping for the future of plastic recycling to improve.
Right, right. And to build on both of those great answers, I think one major thing that is missed sometimes here is the collection and the sortation of all of these materials. So while you have this chemical recycling coming online, how do we get consumers to know that, hey, this chip bag or whatever it is, this can be put into this bin so it can be recycled this way instead of this other plastic that looks the same to an untrained eye and sometimes to trained eyes that looks the exact same. How do we tell them which thing to recycle where? And one way to do that is the How to Recycle label is a great way to do that, and that you get that label based on check locally, whether it's widely recycled, all of that kind of stuff. So I think that, yeah, it's a very complex question.
I'm just going to add in one other point to build on what both of you were just saying. There's the issue of the infrastructure today, but there's also that issue of goals that companies are setting for themselves and some NGOs have set. And the infrastructure that's ready today is very different than the infrastructure that we expect to see in 5 or 10 years. So if goals are aligned with that 5 or 10 year point, the picture changes completely again, and they do intersect at a very good point. But there's nothing other than the dynamics of economics that seem to be pulling those, they're two parallel paths. There's the path of organizations and companies that are saying that they're going to have everything recyclable, reusable, or returnable, or whatever the 3 R's are for the new plastic economy, and they've set goals of 2025 or 2030, whatever they may be. And then there's the infrastructure path, and the two are not, they're mutually exclusive. And so has to be some guesstimation on a regional basis on when that collision will occur, where there's a perfect balance or a better balance.
Yeah, and actually you just reminded me of a point. I'm sorry, Tony.
No, go. This is what I promised to offer.
Yeah, and FYI, this is exactly how our discussions went pre-event. But that the returnable piece reminds me that sometimes it's not even just looking at single-use plastics.
Yeah.
I mean, Tony works at Loop, which is all about the reuse and return and all of that. And that in itself, again, if reuse starts becoming more common, if more consumers are willing to adopt that will again change the dynamic. Currently, companies I don't think are fully anticipating how willing consumers may be to refill and reuse and return alternatives. And so the goals in itself might be shifting just in the next 5 years based on the way that consumers are evolving, the way that consumers are changing their behaviors. So I think that it's so dynamic, and that's part of the problem, but also can be part of the solution.
All very good points, and as somebody who's spent a decade in recycling, again, it's complicated, and a lot of people don't know, and it is nuanced, and it is about education and understanding what I should do. My wife is a hippie from the west coast of Canada, and I call her the ultimate wish cycler, where she just puts everything in the blue bin and crosses her fingers, which horrifies me as somebody who works in recycling. But we keep it spicy. And even in my own personal experience, I come from banking and finance and law. That's where I was trained as a professional. And my aha moment in recycling was I was living in Austria and Vienna at the time. And I took my recycling down to our recycling center in our apartment, and I put all my recycling in one bin, which we probably would all agree, yeah, that makes sense. But I proceeded to get yelled at in German for about 10 minutes by an 80-year-old woman because they separate into 8 different categories there. There's flexible plastics, there's rigid plastics, there's glass, clear glass, colored glass, coated paper, uncoated paper, Tetra Pak. So I think there's a lot to be said, and I kind of, again, throwing it back to our panel here, considering these nuances, this complicated environment that we live in, are there considerations about the consumer that a brand owner should also consider as they go about looking for the right packaging for them?
I can start there. I mean, in food packaging, one thing to consider here is food waste. So if you are packaging a product that is sticky or is going to leave a contaminated package, that might not be the best thing for a recycled package because it has to be clean and dry, right? So maybe that should go compostable. But then if when you take maybe a paper package instead of a plastic package, that's going to give you less barrier for oxygen, moisture, grease, etc. So that right there is going to give you more food waste. So it's a huge balance based on which way you should go. And so typically what we say at Print Pack to Brands is let's talk through it. Like let's go big picture. What do you need to do? What is your product? What is the condition of use? Is it food service? Are they on the go? Is it at an airport? Wherever it may be. And let's drill down into what options the consumer has for that package and then move that direction. Instead of saying, okay, all of our packaging has to go to paper or has to go to recyclable plastic. It may not fit. And it may not fit for the recyclers either. They don't want to get, a bag of peanut butter or something like that. They don't want to have to wash that out. And so taking into account that end of life is super important in this space.
Yeah, and I would build on that exactly to the point that when I talk to our clients, I always force them to be a consumer versus the person that works at the CPG company. And it's like, do you want your pair of shoes to arrive in a paper parcel where the shoes have been crumpled? Or do you want it to actually come in a paper box because it's protected, things like that? Because I think at the end of the day, if the consumers are unhappy or if the consumers aren't satisfied, and most importantly, the consumers don't behave the way that you predict in your model, like if they're not putting it in the right recycling bin, all of your work and effort, which takes a lot of time and a lot of money, is just gone to waste. So I think starting with the consumer and what their behavior is either today or what you think it might be in a few years is the point where brand owners and the upstream supply chain has to start. Otherwise the whole system just falls apart, unfortunately.
You also want to be brand owners and business owners can have a lot of different motivating factors behind their decision on what packaging to choose as well as what goals to set for themselves and how they're going to promote that new packaging evolution to consumers. And there's a lot of opportunity for boomerangs in there to come flying back at you in the day, the age of social media, or sometimes we'll say to a customer, you're always one Anderson Cooper report away from, having the worst thing that ever happened to your brand. And so when one is making considerations about paper versus plastic or what's right, you also want to be very careful and probably even involve a legal review today of any claims that you're going to make about the practical recyclability of whatever choice you're making. Because there are potential, there's potential legislation, there's potential litigation, there's potential challenges just from the consumers and from social media and other media avenues, that if you make the wrong or a claim that someone else completely disagrees with that has a loud voice, you can find yourself potentially in a courtroom, potentially on a report at night on television, and certainly being laughed at on TikTok or whatever it might be. So nobody wants that. Not a good way to build a brand.
Great. Let's keep it moving because we're going along at a good pace. We want to leave some time for questions as well. So, are there any standards or guidelines to follow when thinking about recyclable paper and recyclable plastic, especially when it comes to flexibles? So I don't know. Lou or Megan, you guys can fight over who goes first.
There's the first advice we would give would be, there's the green guide that the federal government has put out is from a truth in advertising perspective, although I think it's 600 pages or something. It's not very easily navigable.
There's a summary available.
That document is sort of the only real Bible from a legislative or a legal perspective that you can have to review. Get really good advice from from your supplier partners if you don't have that advice internally. And trade associations can also be very, very good, reliable resources. I think you could probably, I'm guessing, Megan, you belong to many of the citizens, and you can make some good recommendations in that direction.
Yeah, I am an executive on the executive committee for Sustainable Packaging Coalition, who's connected with the How to Recycle label. So that's a way to tell consumers, like, recycle, take back to store, clean and dry, or remove this cap and then recycle this part of it, that kind of stuff. Tell them what to recycle and what not to recycle. So that with the FTC guidelines, I mean, make sure that what you are claiming is legal, but then also make sure what you are claiming is easy to understand, because I mean, even I get confused, and this is my job. So with different types of plastic. So I think that when you're looking at it from a legislative perspective, like you said, there's a ton of different stuff there to unpack. But then when you're looking at it from a technical perspective as well, there are percentages of different materials that can be in an all polyethylene package or to be in a coated paper package and all of that stuff. So technically, there are a lot more guidelines that you have to design to, and a lot of things that are typically assumed in traditional packaging that are not assumed in sustainable packaging. So it's a completely different playing field, and you have to kind of level set in that way as well.
Yeah. And there are a lot of certifications out there that people have started or people have been pursuing to be like, this is compostable, this is biodegradable. But I think people, or consumers at least, are now starting to realize that those certifications are tests done in a lab in a very controlled setting that do not reflect reality whatsoever today. And so it's becoming even more important for brand owners to communicate what they've done very accurately to avoid greenwashing, as we were saying previously, and be able to actually make a difference and actually have consumers do what they need them with the How to Recycle labels. We've seen so many different versions of recycling labels through decades, and nothing has ever worked because they're either too complex or they just lack information, and so consumers kind of give up. And so it's about finding a balance between all of these versions that have been tried and failed, while still kind of, I think, looking towards what will be the emerging technologies 5 years, 10 years from now, and preparing to start integrating or adopting them as well, whilst not ruling out today's technologies.
Right, and I think what's also interesting is when you're talking about sortation of all of this at a MRF or a material recovery facility, we are designing to the lowest common denominator, to the least technologically advanced MRF. We're not designing to the optical sorters with all the different lasers and all kinds of different stuff. We're designing to people, like human beings sorting things off the line. And so while a lot of things could be recyclable, and all polypropylene structure is technically recyclable, but is it recycled is the question. Do we have a stream for it? Is there a collection for it? Can MRFs sort that out? So I think it's like everything in this conversation, it's extremely complicated.
And extremely relative.
Extremely relative, yes.
I think that's a really good point. And somebody speaking as a recycler, a lot of times you guys will consult, and everything you said was 100% accurate, and there's Bibles and summaries of Bibles that you can refer to. Be inquisitive. Ask the people who are handling things at the end of the life as well. Ask that MRF. If you've never spoken to a MRF, which is a material recovery facility, would you want this? Would you want to sort this out and recycle it? I think that's a really powerful question that a lot of times isn't asked, in our opinion. Our CEO gives a ridiculous example when it comes to recycling, and that's if we want 100% recyclability and actually things being recycled, if we made all of our packs from gold, see how many people throw that away. There's going to be a lot of hands in that cookie jar wanting to get that packaging. That's a ridiculous example, but I think the point remains true. It's about that desire, that want to recycle something. So ask the MRF. And the last one that I would say, in my experience, sometimes ask the retailer. I think this is more for larger brands, but retailers usually have a very detailed path towards their goals around recycling, and ultimately they're going to call you, the brand, and say this is our path, design into it. So we have an interesting story from a retailer in Europe, for instance, who's a big national retailer, who gave a roadmap to their brands and said, if you're in compostable packaging, you will be delisted by the end of 2022 because the infrastructure in our company for compostability is not there yet. So sometimes that's also a good check in my experience. So this is a question that I think we all got spirited in discussing, was how robust is the supply chain for recycled plastics and paper? So talking about PCR. And what is that tension between demand of people who want that material and what actually exists?
Right. I think that goes back to what are we aiming for with recycling? Are we aiming for true circularity? All of your medical packages, are you going to use that a recycled content in your package? No, there's typically no reclaim allowed. Same kind of thing in food packaging. It's hard to get a recycled fiber or recycled polyethylene, whatever it may be, into a food direct contact for food package or a medical package. So I think that being more open to, this bottle doesn't necessarily have to become another bottle. At the beginning, it's a great goal. I think that it is a very important goal to get there. But in the meantime, in the interim, why are we using virgin plastic? I could be wrong here, but why are we using virgin plastic for little things like toys? Why aren't we using, the medical and food grade plastics that we're all throwing away? Why aren't we collecting those and using those for the lesser, with regulatory, whatever it may be, lesser applications? Why are we using virgin plastic for some of that kind of stuff? So I think that is a massive issue, especially with recycled fiber, with PFAS, PVDC, all of that stuff. It's hard to take in recycled content as a food packaging company and a medical packaging company. It's hard to put that into our packages just because of all of the problems that it could create for consumers and for hospitals and all of that.
And I think it's an infrastructure issue as well. Right now, there just isn't enough infrastructure for recycled plastics that is the demand. Not, even putting aside the food and the medical industries, there's just so much demand because of these sustainability goals that are coming up. And there's just lack of supply. There's no supply at the moment, basically, or if any becomes available, it's the largest companies that claim to it. Like Coca-Cola will take all of the recycled PET available for their bottles, leaving nothing for anyone else. And so it's becoming almost like a Hunger Games situation. I'm sorry if people don't know what Hunger Games is, but that's what it's coming down to. And it's like the brands are just fighting amongst themselves for whatever becomes available, versus something like paper, which has had a robust recycling infrastructure relatively. And recycled paper is used, every cardboard box is made out of recycled paper pulp, basically. So I think this is one of those instances. If you haven't gathered by now, by the way, I think plastics have a lot of advantages, and I'm not an anti-plasticer. But I think in this instance, paper definitely wins over plastics, and the plastics industry has to learn the recycling piece of it and how to work to not, like Megan said, how to not take a bottle into a bottle, but take a bottle into something else, and not be so fixated on this idea of a circular economy. We're building more of a the loop economy, or just an oval or something like that, so that at least it's being used somewhere, and it's not just going waste because it can't be a bottle, or it can't be pill pack or something like that. In a normal supply world, like we're not, as the world evolves from COVID right now, the supply and the freeze in Texas, fires and storms and whatever, the Tower of Babel falling, whatever else has happened out there in the supply stream, we're not in a typical supply stream. But when we come back to equilibrium, hopefully we do one day, as we get there, there's also the challenge to the supply chain of the herd mentality. And if many large brand owners all at once start shifting, say, towards all polyethylene packaging, there simply is not enough capacity to take large-scale shifts today into that. And when I did a little survey looking at my competitors' websites, and I looked at
30 of the leading competitors in the United States, or converters in the United States. 29 of us had a feature on our websites about monomaterial polyethylene recyclable plastic. You do it, we do it, you know. And that's great, but from a practical perspective, if all of our customers want to go there at the same time, we're advertising for a problem, a supply chain problem that at a strategic level needs to be considered by supply chain brand owners and their supply chains. That same equation doesn't necessarily exist for paper. You know, paper has a strong, robust infrastructure that's been in place for a long time. That begins to enter in a lot of more practical questions about barrier and fitness for use and all those sorts of things. But, you know, when you're looking at this decision, paper versus plastic, and what is the next direction and what's the next evolution of my packaging development, in addition to all of the other things that we talked about, you know, whether you're looking at post-consumer recycled resin, and I haven't been able to find an index that actually follows how much of that stuff exists. You know, we have Coke and Pepsi and 7-Up teaming up on TV commercials saying, bring us your PET bottles because we need the PET to make more bottles. That's because there isn't enough of the post-consumer recycled resin out there to fit a lot of the demand that's coming forward for it. So you've got to, you need to really have a much bigger picture look at these considerations about what is how robust is that supply chain, how dependable is that supply chain, and where is my business and my supplier going to fit into that to keep me supplied in this, in this new direction that we're going in.
I think that an interesting point there too is that when you think about what consumers understand and how they need to deal with this package that they now have, the aisles of the grocery store kind of need to move together while there are supply chain constraints. I mean, if you have, a Nature Valley bar versus a Kashi bar versus whatever kind of bar, one's compostable, one is all recyclable PE, one's recyclable paper, consumers get confused, and then you're going to have MRFs sitting there like, I don't want this compostable package, why is this here? But they can't tell the difference either. And so supply chain aside, it would be best if the aisles moved together. All of the snack bars are all polyethylene or all compostable, whatever. So all of the consumers can say, okay, this is a snack bar, this goes compostable. And I think getting brands on board to kind of move together, which is not really what happens now, that would be very helpful for the consumer education piece of this whole puzzle.
And I think the last piece that also fits into it is the concept of dematerialization to an extent too, of getting rid of the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary levels of packaging. Like, when you buy your ice lollies, why is it in a cardboard box with plastic inside? Why do we have so many different layers of packaging? Why? And I've seen, I was actually reading about Colgate's new Keep toothbrushes. So all of you are familiar, toothbrushes come in the plastic thing with the paper on the back, but Colgate's most recent toothbrush launch is all in just a paper box, essentially. They got rid of the two different materials. They changed their form factor for their packaging in an effort to essentially lower the amount of packaging that they're using. And I think as more brands opt for that solution, as more brands start thinking, oh wait, we can actually have a better product to packaging ratio and thereby reduce the amount of overall packaging we're using, that will also probably help, because going back to the ice lolly, consumers are like, okay, so this box goes in the paper recycling bin, but this plastic goes in this bin. What? I just wanted an ice lolly. And they don't want to have to deal with having so many different things thrown at them. So
with that said, we have 5 minutes left. I have one more question for our panelists, and maybe we can do a lightning round kind of elevator plug. But what is your company doing to offer options to your customers today?
Right, so what we are doing at PrintPack is early last year, before all this craziness, we created a technical sustainability team called the Office of Sustainability. We have four 5, but 4 specific areas that we have engineers dedicated to developing platforms. We have recyclable paper, we have compostables, those can go together if designed correctly, and we've got all polyethylene because that's the only flexible stream that we have in North America right now, and then we have post-consumer recycled and renewable materials. So what we're doing is we're saying we want to help our customers meet your goals, whether it's compostable, recyclable, paper, or plastic. We are a technical team that is working on development across the board, not for one specific customer, but for a platform, so we can offer it to everyone. So that's what we're doing.
We're doing something very similar. We have subject matter experts that are aligned with either application or material science or the market that the customer is in. And then we have oversight with some people in what we call our solutions team that just work on sustainability options and issues and trying to stay involved with the with different organizations and keeping up to date with the latest news, because it's a constant moving, it morphs every 6 months. We are reevaluating what we're prioritizing. But the big thing we try to do is listen to our customers, understand their goals, understand their objectives, understand what conditions that they're trying to work in, what their product is, the protection that it needs, and then we just put the subject matter experts together, trying to find a pathway for them. And it's a very similar approach, I think.
So we have a few minutes before we're going to get kicked off here. Let's open it up to the audience. Any questions?